Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. In today's video I have one more dupe of the Blood Sugar palette for you from Revolution. This is the third Revolution dupe for this palette. We had the Reloaded Red Alert, and we had from the I Heart Makeup line the palette called Red Velvet. And now today we have a palette from the Forever Flawless line called Unconditional Love. If the packaging seems to be familiar, that could be because I already reviewed one of the Forever Flawless palettes. That one was called Ice, and that was a blue eyeshadow palette, which turned out to be a really good dupe for the Blue Blood palette from Jeffree Star. And here we are today reviewing a dupe from the same line for the Blood Sugar palette. By the way, they also have a Huda Beauty new nude dupe in this line called Allure, and I won't be able to review that because I already got rid of my new nude palette, but I thought I should just let you know. And I'm gonna have another one coming on my channel very soon called Fire, which is going to be a Natasha Denona Sunset palette dupe. So this line has a lot of great dupes. Now, when you first look at this palette, honestly, it looks nothing like the Blood Sugar palette. And when I first saw this palette, I honestly didn't think much of it. But then I came across swatches and I thought, hold on, that looks like the Blood Sugar palette. So I decided to order it, and I'm so glad I did because it is a Blood Sugar palette dupe. You do have some shades like Platonic or Movie that are obviously not in the Blood Sugar palette. So this is not a straight on dupe. It's not the same as the Reloaded Red Alert palette was, which was an exact dupe of the Blood Sugar palette. This one is more like inspired by it. Some shades are super similar. For example, you have both of the shimmery shades from the Blood Sugar palette in this palette as well. And as you can see, it's a very neutral and red toned palette, so it is really similar. I'm gonna insert the swatches for you, and as you can see from the swatches, most of the shades are not exact dupes of each other. However, overall, if you look at them, they are giving you the exact same vibe. And whilst most of the times you won't be able to achieve what I did today, which is an absolutely identical eye makeup look with the two palettes, you will be able to achieve the same kind of vibe from this palette. So whilst it's not an identical dupe, it is pretty much giving you the same type of an eye makeup look. And let's be honest, no one can really tell if it's that exact eyeshadow palette or is it just something that has the same kind of a tone to it. So what I mean by that is that there are certain shades that really can stand out and change a look, and you can look at someone and say, are you wearing this and this palette? But in the case of something like the Blood Sugar palette, it doesn't need to be exactly identical to achieve the same kind of look. Once again, it has all of those neutrals and it has very similar reds. So when you do an eye makeup look using this palette, you will pretty much get the same look that you would get using the Blood Sugar palette, despite not having the same shades. Just want to very quickly show you the two palettes next to each other. Obviously the bottom one is the Blood Sugar palette, and honestly, it's not that much of a red toned palette. The reason people tend to think that is because of the background. In Shane Dawson's series, they very nicely explained how much the background can change the whole look of an eyeshadow palette, and that's definitely the case with this Blood Sugar palette. It's actually not that red. You get a couple of red shades in the bottom row, but really that's about it. And if you really look at the shades, you pretty much get the same one in the top palette. The shades that are definitely missing are this white one, this purple one, and this true red shade. Everything else is pretty much there. The Blood Sugar palette retails for £52. It was made in the USA and it has 1.5 grams of product in each pan. In 18 pan, that overall gives you 27 grams of product. The Unconditional Love palette was made in China, despite that it is cruelty-free. It also has 18 pens inside, but overall it only contains 15 grams of product, which means you get less than 1 gram of product per pen. And both of these eyeshadow palettes have 12 months shelf life, which is quite short. I would honestly just carry on using them after that anyways. This palette retails for £12, but it being Revolution, you will most of the time be able to get discount on that. For example, right now at some places it is available for £8. Once again, in today's makeup I created this eye using the Revolution palette, and even though at the beginning I thought it's gonna look slightly different but somewhat similar, I can actually say that it turned out identical. I honestly don't think anyone would be able to tell that they're not the same palette, so I'm quite impressed. I'm very impressed with the performance of the palette as well. I hardly had any fallout. It worked really nicely. The shimmery shade is actually more shimmery on the dupe side than it is on the original side, but I have complained already about this shade from Jeffree Star before. It appears to be shimmery in the pan. I believe it's supposed to be shimmery, but it's actually quite a matte shade, which is disappointing because it could be a gorgeous duochrome shade. But regardless, the two eyes look almost identical, and I honestly didn't feel like I needed to put any extra effort into replicating the same thing on the dupe side, which was really surprising. And I'm very happy with this dupe palette. I'm actually quite surprised that I don't really see anyone on YouTube mentioning how similar this one is to the Blood Sugar palette, so you might have a Blood Sugar dupe without even knowing it, in case you have this palette already. I think it's a gorgeous palette, and I love all the shades that are not in the Blood Sugar palette. It was actually the same thing with the Ice palette. That palette had shades that the Blue Blood palette didn't have, and it had the most gorgeous silver I have ever seen, and even the blue shades most of the times performed better than the original one. So this Revolution Forever Flawless eyeshadow palette line is definitely something to look out for, because these eyeshadow palettes are very high quality, especially considering the price and considering that they are in drugstore. They are super eyeshadow palettes. Nevertheless, we're gonna now jump into creating this eye makeup look. I will show you which shades I used, and I will tell you with each step what I think about that particular shade. And once we're done creating this eye makeup look, we're gonna get back here and I will give you my final thoughts. So as always, I'm gonna be using the more expensive palette on this side of the face, which is today going to be the Jeffree Star Blood Sugar palette, and the more affordable palette on this side of the face, which is today going to be the Revolution Makeup Forever Flawless Unconditional Love palette. From now on, I'm just gonna refer to it as the Love palette because that name is just far too long to say every single time. I primed my eyes already, so we can jump right into creating this eye makeup look. It's gonna be a little bit tricky because I want to try to stick to the shades that are present in both palettes, and like I showed you with the swatches, there are actually not that many of them. There are tons of shades that are really similar, but very few are actually close enough to recreate the same look on both sides. First I'm going to take Cake Mix from the Jeffree Star palette, and I'm gonna add that shade to the crease just to start off the look. And I normally like to use the same shade to frame the eye, so I'm gonna take some of Cake Mix under my eye as well. Now in the Revolution palette we have two shades right next to each other, Promiser and Official, and even though in the pan Promiser seems quite similar to Cake Mix, when you swatch it, it's actually a lot darker than it appears to be here. So I'm gonna take Official and I'm gonna see if that's dark enough, and if it's not, then I'm gonna add a bit of Promiser into it. So once again, this is the shade Official, and that seems to be quite similar actually. Yeah, that's basically the same thing, and what I'm really happy about is that it's not completely flat. I can see lighter and darker areas, which is quite rare for a drugstore dupe palette. So now I think I'm gonna place down the darker shade on the outer edge of this, and after that we're gonna create that half cut crease and apply the shimmery shade in the inner half of the eye, and then work the two into each other. So to darken up the outer corner, I'm gonna take some of Coma, and as always I started with placing it to my outer V, and then I'm going to blend it and apply some more, then blend it again until I'm happy with it. Obviously this Blood Sugar palette is very iconic. I would say that after the Modern Renaissance palette from Anastasia Beverly Hills, this is probably the second most iconic eyeshadow palette ever made. So tons of different brands have their own version of a dupe for this eyeshadow palette, because obviously everyone wants to have their own cut from that hype that surrounds this eyeshadow palette. So even here on my channel I have done a lot of eyeshadow palette reviews of different dupes for this palette, and what I compare the dupe palettes to is really that £4 Revolution Reloaded palette called Red Alert, which is, like I said, £4, and it's an exact dupe. Every single shade is exactly the same. That palette is incredible, especially considering the price point. I don't want to lie, it's maybe £5, not 4. Those eyeshadow palettes are priced a bit interesting. Some of them are £4, some of them are 5, so it might be £5, but still it's a really big difference between the original one and the dupe palette, and it's such a good palette. So I compare every other dupe palette to that one, to be honest with you, because that one is such a good palette, and I don't know how this palette will perform obviously, but just the fact that the shades are not exactly the same is already a big minus, because obviously if you are looking for a dupe, most of the times you want an exact dupe because you are interested in that palette. Otherwise you would just buy whatever other eyeshadow palette, not a dupe. So I will review this palette keeping in mind that there are other options which are exact dupes and for 3 times or 2 times cheaper than this. So in the Love palette, as you can see, the darkest shade we have is called Untouched, and this one is at first glance a lot cooler toned. It's almost more like a dark brownish purplish shade, not exactly the same type of a dark burgundy as Coma is. So I'm not sure if I will be able to recreate this on this side. If this one is too cool toned, I might add a little bit of Love Letter into it, because this seems to be more of a burgundy shade. But I'm starting with Untouched, and I'm gonna be doing the same thing you saw me doing on this side. I'm gonna be adding the dark shade, blending it out, and then adding more until I'm happy with it. Yeah, it's definitely missing that redness to it. So I'm gonna take some of Love Letter now and see if that will make it more similar to the other side. Almost there, but I feel like it's still missing a bit of that pink element. So I'm gonna take a little bit of Swipe and add Swipe into it, and that should make it look a lot more similar. That's it. I think now they look super similar. So now I'm gonna go off camera and I'm gonna prepare the half cut crease for the shimmery shade. Okay, so as you can see, the half cut crease is done. We're gonna move on to the shimmery shade now. From the Blood Sugar palette, the shade is going to be Sweetener. This shade Sweetener takes quite a lot of building up to get shimmery at all. It stays matte for a very long time, which is interesting because it seems to be quite shimmery in the pan. The shade we have in the dupe palette is called Love, and it's a very similar pink duochrome shade. I actually have a feeling this is gonna be more shimmery than the original one. Yeah, can you see how much more reflective the dupe palette is? Other than that, they are super similar. Okay, so now I'm gonna take some of Coma again and darken up the outer corner again. And I'm not gonna spend too much time working it into each other with the shimmery shade, because we're gonna be using one more shade here to help work them into each other, so it's not too much blending needed there right now. Again, from the Love palette, I'm gonna take a combination of Untouched and Love Letter. I'm gonna try to already mix them together on the brush, so I don't need to apply them separate. Okay, so now I'm gonna take some of Tongue Pop, and I'm gonna take that on a smaller smoky shader brush. I normally don't talk about what brush I'm taking, but sometimes I feel like I should. And although in the pan it looks like Unconditional is similar to the shade, in reality I swatched them and Koi is a lot more similar. So I'm gonna take a bit of Koi and we're gonna repeat the same thing on the dupe side. And that's it. I'm gonna go now off camera and I'm gonna finish my makeup, apply some eyeliner, mascara, lipstick, add some shimmer in my inner corners, and I'm gonna be back to tell you my final thoughts. Alright guys, so once again, here's the finished makeup look. I cannot tell the difference whatsoever, even though they are two quite different eyeshadow palettes at first glance. If you just take a bit of time to find a similar shade to the one in the Blood Sugar palette, you will be able to create identical looks. Not with every single shade, like I said before, there are quite a few shades completely missing from the Unconditional Love palette, but in exchange you get extra ones that you don't have in the Blood Sugar palette. So overall I find the Unconditional Love palette more versatile than the Blood Sugar palette, because the Blood Sugar palette definitely has some shades that are interchangeable and unnecessary to have, whilst the Unconditional Love palette gives you some really beautiful shades that I wish we had in the Blood Sugar palette. I understand though that the whole idea behind Blood Sugar palette is that the shades are going to be similar colors to the shade of blood, so you can't really have tons of different purples, although he did put some purples and even one quite bright pink in there, so I mean you could argue that, but nevertheless this Unconditional Love palette is really similar, even though at first you wouldn't think so. And if you're looking for a good quality dupe for the Blood Sugar palette, this is definitely one to keep in mind. That's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, because I would love to have you here. And until next time, take care of yourself. I will see you very soon.